You know, when you think about the most notorious drug cartels in history, your mind probably jumps straight to modern kingpins, right? Maybe secret jungle labs or illicit border tunnels. But what if I told you that the most powerful, ruthlessly efficient drug cartel in human history wasn't a shadowy underworld gang at all? Actually, it was a totally legitimate, state-sponsored empire. Today we're unpacking a true crime historical narrative that's honestly just as shocking as it is influential to our world today. We're going to look at how a polite, high society obsession with tea literally turned the British Empire into the greatest drug dealers ever. It's a wild story of economics, addiction, warfare, and, well, breathtaking hypocrisy. So how exactly did a love for tea create the world's biggest drug cartel? Okay, let's dive into this. To figure out how a global drug syndicate was born out of a craving for a warm, cozy beverage, we've got to jump back to the 18th century. By this point, the British public had developed an absolute obsession with drinking tea. It was the cultural staple. But there was a massive geopolitical problem attached to this seemingly innocent daily habit. We're going to see how a simple cup of tea directly bridged the gap between polite British society and illicit international drug running.
By the 1790s, the British East India Company was hauling in roughly 10,000 tons of tea from China to London every single year. They also really wanted Chinese silk and porcelain. But China saw this relationship very differently. The Chinese emperor at the time basically said, look, our celestial empire possesses all things. We don't need to import anything from outside barbarians. Meaning, China's economy was totally self-sufficient. They didn't want British manufactured goods at all. The only thing they were willing to accept in exchange for all that tea was hard currency, solid silver.
And that created a catastrophic trade imbalance. By the late 1700s, an astonishing 90% of all British exports to China were just silver bullion. 90%! The British Empire was literally bleeding silver just to feed its caffeine habit, and it was seriously threatening the stability of their own currency. So the East India Company was getting frantic. They needed to find a commodity, really any commodity, that they could produce on the cheap and that the Chinese public would actively demand just to stop this massive financial drain. And what they ended up finding was a pretty sinister new currency.
To fix their cash flow problem, they set up a ruthless triangle trade route. The East India Company took control of Bengal and India and locked down a strict monopoly over growing opium poppies. They manufactured the drug right there in India. But here's the catch. They couldn't exactly just march into China and sell it legally. The Chinese government had banned non-medicinal opium consumption way back in 1729. So the British pioneered a tactic that modern cartels still use today: plausible deniability. The company sold the opium in India to private, independent middlemen, these country firms, who then sailed it over to the Pearl River estuary in China, where it was smuggled ashore by local networks. Basically, the British technically disowned the drug at the border, while quietly raking in all the profits.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that we aren't talking about some shadowy back-alley laboratory. This was the staggering reality of a state-run drug operation. Just think about the sheer scale of the East India Company's opium factory in Patna, India. You had these towering racks stretching as far as the eye can see, packed with thousands upon thousands of opium balls being prepped for export. It essentially looked like a modern industrial warehouse, but entirely dedicated to an illicit narcotic. The British Empire had weaponized drug production on a scale the world had literally never seen before. The explosive escalation of this whole smuggling operation is honestly terrifying when you look at the numbers. Back when the first ban hit in 1729, about 200 chests a year were slipping into China. By the early 19th century, that jumped to 4,000 chests. But then, the East India Company lost its monopoly on British trade in 1834, and things just went into hyperdrive. To stay competitive, private British and American dealers started slashing their prices to hook even more customers. By 1838, they were smuggling over 40,200 chests into China. To put that into perspective, that's over 1,300 tons of illegal opium flooding into a sovereign nation in a single year.
So you might be wondering, why didn't the British government step in and put a stop to this illegal trade? Well, the crucial point is 17%. The profits from selling opium eventually accounted for up to 17% of the entire British India government's revenue. 17%! It wasn't just a side hustle, it was a state-sponsored necessity. Historians actually point out that this drug money was so foundational to the imperial economy that without it, the British Empire in Asia might not have even survived. They were entirely hooked on their own profits.
Meanwhile, across the water, China was facing an absolute catastrophe. Sure, the British had successfully reversed their trade deficit, silver was now pouring out of China and right back into British pockets, but the human toll was just devastating.
Estimates suggest that anywhere between 4 million and 12 million Chinese people became addicted. And this wasn't just a massive public health emergency, it was a total economic disaster, because as all that silver drained out of the local Chinese economy, its value skyrocketed. So ordinary farmers, people who had never even seen an opium pipe, suddenly found themselves facing financial ruin because they had to sell vastly more crops just to afford their standard taxes, which, remember, had to be paid in silver.
Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was outraged. The Dongguan emperor launched a really fierce campaign against the drug, stating quite clearly that opium is a poison, undermining their good customs and morality. Chinese officials didn't just see this as an economic attack, but a deeply moral one. The emperor appointed a brilliant commissioner named Lin Zexu to finally end the trade. Lin even went so far as to pen an open letter to Queen Victoria, directly appealing to her Christian morality and asking how the civilized British could possibly justify poisoning another nation just for profit. It's a staggering irony, right? Appealing to the morality of a profit-driven drug cartel? That letter actually got published in London, but officially, the British government just completely ignored it.
So Lin Zexu quickly realized that appealing to the conscience of a drug cartel was pretty much useless. He decided to hit them where it actually hurt. In 1839, he ordered a blockade of the foreign trading factories in Canton, basically holding the merchants hostage until they handed over their illegal stockpiles. And it worked. They surrendered. Lin seized an unbelievable 20,000 chests of British opium, which was worth millions of pounds, and had it publicly destroyed at Human. He essentially flushed 1,300 tons of the British Empire's most lucrative product straight down the drain.
Let's move to 1840 and see how this builds, because this is the exact moment the cartel takes off its velvet glove. How does the world's biggest drug dealer respond to a massive, multi-million-pound drug bust? Well, with advanced industrialized warships, of course. Britain dispatched a naval expedition to China to forcibly defend their so-called right to smuggle illegal drugs. And that triggered the First Opium War. Leveraging their vastly superior military tech, the British inflicted crushing defeats on the Chinese military, mercilessly punishing the exact nation that was just trying to enforce its own drug laws.
The war finally ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, which really marks the start of what's known as China's Century of Humiliation. The terms the British forced upon them were just astonishing. Britain made China pay massive reparations. Think about that. They essentially made China reimburse the drug dealers for the illegal drugs they had destroyed, plus the entire cost of the war. On top of that, they forced the opening of 5 new treaty ports for British trade, completely gutting China's strict trade regulations. Oh, and significantly, they forced China to hand over the island of Hong Kong to the British Crown. And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. These newly opened treaty ports, along with Hong Kong, immediately transformed into the principal entrepôts, the main distribution hubs, for pouring even greater quantities of British opium directly into the Chinese market. The British had literally gone to war, conquered foreign territory, and completely rewritten international trade laws, all just to optimize the logistics of their drug cartel. It is an almost unbelievable level of state-sponsored racketeering. So this brings up a huge question. How is it that today we don't instantly remember the British Empire primarily as a giant drug cartel? Well, fast forward to the early 20th century and we see an incredible rebrand. A few big things happened. First off, global geopolitics shifted. The United States was emerging as a real power in Asia and pushing an open-door policy that really frowned on these old colonial monopolies. Second, a massive wave of domestic narcophobia swept through Britain. There's a huge moral panic over cocaine and opium use at home during the First World War. Once drugs became a criminal problem inside their own borders, the optics of being a state-sponsored drug dealer abroad suddenly became politically toxic. So, Britain pivoted hard. They started heavily backing new League of Nations drug regulation initiatives, smoothly transitioning their image from the world's absolute biggest drug pusher to the leading voice of moralistic global drug control. It's a historical pivot of just breathtaking audacity. How does a global drug empire successfully rebrand as the world's drug police? It leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox to ponder. The very imperial power that fought multiple wars to force illicit drugs into a sovereign nation eventually became a founding architect of our modern international drug control system. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much of our modern geopolitical landscape, our international trade laws, and even our global drug policies are built directly on top of the profits and legacy of the world's greatest drug cartel. Think about that the next time you hear